Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Derek Kolleeny, and I've been asked to give a talk on the presentation of meditation by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, in what way it was unique. And I'm glad we have a few hours here today because I have a lot to go through, and his technique was very unique, and there's a lot of different aspects of that, and the way he presented it, and the logic, and the way he trained students, and the progression of the practice. So I'm glad that we have a few hours to do that here today. Oh, we only have 1 hour, no, 30 minutes? 45, no, 40, okay, 47, 48, 47 and a half minutes, okay. So I'll try to be brief. And for starters, I think it's helpful to understand beforehand that Trungpa Rinpoche can be difficult to comprehend. The way he speaks, his use of English language, and the cadence or rhythm of his voice can be very difficult to understand. And so it's important to pay very close attention to what he's saying, and at the same time to sort of let go of your mind a little bit. This is not a presentation on some linear topic that might happen in a school or a business situation. And so it's not an analytical endeavor experiencing his transmission of the essence of Buddhism and enlightenment in the way he does when he teaches meditation. And that is exactly what he's doing when he teaches meditation, is that he's conveying the enlightened state. And so it's important to remember that the details are a support for that experience, for that transmission. And to relax your mind a little bit and sort of merge your mind with his to the extent you can, and let his presentation, the oddity of the way he speaks in English in terms of grammar and word usage, not throw you off completely, but create an experience where your mind relaxes and opens and becomes much more aware of itself and what's going on in general. Additionally, it's very difficult to understand the subtlety of the nuances of what he presents, which is why I'm so happy that this course is being held in general, because this presentation that he gave in 1974 was, in terms of the vast array of presentations that he gave on meditation in particular and Buddhism in general, is an incredible highlight. And so I'm really thrilled that this is being brought to the public and brought forward and made available and accessible in this way. And I very much appreciate personally, and I think it's an extra wonderful opportunity for all of us to understand and experience his teachings, in that they're supplemented by talks by some of his most eldest, or I should say, I think, accomplished practiced students, such as Ani Pema Chödrön and the many others who are involved in teaching this course. And so this is a great opportunity. It's a great treasure. And I urge you to pay attention to every word of it. And I hope that both Rinpoche's talks and the talks by everybody presenting this course, except this one, of course, will be transcribed and published, because it's very important to study them over and over again. He gives an enormous wealth of material. In this seminar, I read through it again this morning, and I was just sort of blown away by the range and depth of material that he presents. So, moving on, in terms of the uniqueness of his presentation, for starters, you see in the description of this little discussion that Rinpoche's presentation was considered outrageous by Tibetans, which is probably a surprising statement to many of you. What's so outrageous about a teacher presenting the details of meditation practice? This happens many times, probably every day these days, all around the world, in talks, live talks, recorded talks, podcasts, all sorts of different formats. But this is not a traditional format, a traditional scheme. Traditionally, teachings of this intimate and detailed nature were not given to large groups on the subtleties of meditation practice. They were more traditionally given on a one-to-one or small group basis of working with a few select students, or students that one might work with over time in a particular situation. And so for starters, just to do this sort of level of subtlety and depth was unusual at the time for Tibetans. Tibetans did not do this generally. And again, we don't realize this, I think people don't realize this today, but the general presentation by Tibetan teachers in this country at that time, the early 1970s, and for many years around that time, was that the essence of meditation was not presented initially to students. The more traditional scheme of presentation for the Tibetan tradition was to start with practices such as chanting practice, pujas, perhaps the preliminary practices called the nundros, the four door or entryway practices to Vajrayana practice, were commonly given right away by Tibetan teachers to their students in Tibet, and initially in the United States and the West in general. And Rinpoche's presentation was dramatically different than that. Other teachers were having their students chant in Tibetan, things that they didn't understand, words they didn't understand. And Rinpoche wanted everything presented in English. He wanted everything made accessible to the Western mind, and he went to great lengths to translate terms and experiences and topics into understandable English language. In particular, the practice that he transmits here of shamatha and vipassana meditation in the Tibetan scheme is an advanced practice, believe it or not. It appears very simple, very basic, and it's given to beginners all over the world. And in many ways it seems very similar to Buddhist meditation techniques and practices that are taught and practiced by beginners all over the world in other Buddhist traditions. But in the Tibetan tradition, this practice of shamatha and vipassana, in particular in the style that he presented, or the unique technique that he presented, was considered to be an advanced practice of Mahamudra or Maha'ati or Dzogchen, and would come after the preliminary practices and other such preparatory practices, and which would take years of practice and study. And lastly, Rinpoche presented the essence, the heart, a very fruitional approach. Again, it's difficult to see this when we first listen to these teachings. And honestly and personally, this is something I've come to appreciate more and more over the many, many years that I've tried to understand these teachings and the practice, and try to learn how to do the practice, which I'm still working on. Additionally, Rinpoche blends a very traditional presentation way of presenting the Dharma and the practice in terms of providing terminology in Sanskrit and Tibetan and spelling it out and trying to get his students to have that level of sophistication in their understanding was very unusual. Additionally, I've been asked to speak about what are some of the possible sources for this teaching, for this particular technique. And apparently Rinpoche taught this technique when he was in England, years before he came to North America, so it's not something that he developed in North America, although clearly there was a progression in how he presented the teachings of and practice of meditation during his time in North America, in particular the first 5 or so years. But it's we can find parallels or roots of his technique in basically the entire range of the Buddhist tradition, starting with the Buddha, where Rinpoche emphasizes the way to work with sense experience, the way to work with thoughts is simply to acknowledge and to experience them as sense experience and thoughts, and not to add anything further from them. And the way he describes this in one of the talks is almost identical to the way that the Buddha presents this in one of the earliest suttas, as it's said in the Pali tradition, called the Bahiya Sutra, or Sutta, means the one that wore dark bark for his clothing. Interesting choice of outfit, where he says to this particular individual, one should, in the seen will be merely what is seen, in the heard will be merely what is heard, in the sensed will be merely what is sensed, in the cognized will be merely what is cognized. In this way you should train yourself, Bahiya. When Bahiya for you and the seen is merely what is seen, and the cognized is merely what is cognized, then you will not be with that. When Bahiya you are not with that, then you will not be in that. When Bahiya you are not in that, then you will be neither here nor beyond, nor in between the two. And just this is the end of suffering. If you didn't know the context, you might think that was from Mahamudra Doha, from the Tibetan Mahasiddha tradition. In addition, we see some parallels in the Theravadan tradition in terms of labeling, in particular the tradition propagated by Mahasi Sayadaw, where there's a practice of labeling whatever is going on in one's experience. But there the labeling is varied, depending on what one is experiencing. It's very short and curt, but it's very varied. And Rinpoche's use of labeling is, as far as I can tell, is unique. Cannot find any other source that uses his particular style of labeling whatever occurs, sense experience, emotions, thoughts, aches and pains, memories, hopes and fears, as thinking. Additionally, Rinpoche uses the traditional Mahayana framework for shamatha and vipassana. In these talks, referencing the key aspects of shamatha as mindfulness, and he gives the Tibetan for mindfulness, Trengpa, and for knowing, the quality of knowing, Sheshan. And those are the two main qualities of shamatha meditation in the system of Asanga, the Mahayana tradition, which was transmitted to Tibet by Kamala Shila in his presentation on meditation. And so that comes down through the Tibetan tradition and shows up in the way that Trungpa Rinpoche presents the meditation practice. And we also find a large influence of the Vajrayana tradition from which Rinpoche comes, and which basically everything that he teaches is imbued with. Even though he spent a lot of his time teaching Hinayana, so-called Hinayana, and Mahayana, as well as Vajrayana, it all comes from within that context of the view of Vajrayana and the technique of Vajrayana. In particular, in this practice, we see that in the technique of mixing mind with breath, and then mixing mind with space. And this first appears in a poem by an Indian master named Ashwagosha, and is picked up by Machik Labdrung in the Chud tradition. Mixing mind with space is the supreme technique, or the supreme way of working with mind. And then lastly, the overall attitude towards thoughts of no problem, and on the other hand, not dismissing them, is very much the essence of Mahamudra or Maha'ati and Dzogchen practice. Just experiencing thoughts, not cutting them off, not suppressing them, and not encouraging them. And that's a very important distinction, this fine line of the middle way between subtly trying to dismiss thoughts, which many of us try to do, have this inclination that meditation is about not thinking, and we try to diminish or reduce thoughts as being a problem. And it turns out that thoughts are the means for experiencing wakefulness or enlightenment. And so it's very important to experience thoughts, but in a certain way where we don't give them extra energy. We don't get caught in the storyline. We don't go along with them, but we just experience them, and we gradually learn to see various aspects about our thoughts, about habitual patterns of the mind and how they work and where they come from, in particular, how they dwell and where they go. So we see this influence of the Vajrayana and Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions. In particular, let's talk about the technique and how unique the technique is. The open eye technique that Rinpoche teaches is not that unique. It's fairly common in the Buddhist traditions, many Buddhist traditions, although not all. But the most unique aspects of the technique are the emphasis upon precision in working with the breath in a very specific way, where we don't follow the entire cycle of the breath. And this is very radical. We don't focus on the in-breath. And he just says, just let the in-breath happen. Just leave a gap. Just stop. He doesn't say this word exactly, but basically the essence is stop doing on the in-breath. And that's a very subtle, small little change. And but it makes a world of difference in terms of the overall experience and the progression of the practice. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to pay attention to the details in which he presents the technique. And this is the most important one. And a lot of people have trouble working with the alternation of focusing on the out-breath and then leaving a gap, or boycotting, as he often said, or just opening on the in-breath. And many of us will instead follow both breaths, because what's the big deal? And it's important to understand that when a teacher like Trungpa Rinpoche gives particular specific instructions, they are important and they are a big deal. And he, in particular this one, he goes on at length in many, many places about this aspect of the technique. And it pervades the experience, the entire progression of the practice. Basically what's going on is that the out-breath is where we cultivate the mindfulness, the focused attention of the shamatha. That's so important in the shamatha practice. Precision, attention to the detail, that helps us achieve or train in or cultivate or develop stability of mind, strength of mind, clarity of mind, and flexibility of mind. And then on the in-breath, that gap is sort of has a number of different things going on with it. For one, it's the ultimate statement of cutting through spiritual materialism. Rinpoche talks in many places about cutting through spiritual materialism in terms of spiritual materialism of body, speech, and mind. In meditation practice, spiritual materialism manifests in, I want to accomplish doing something. I want to accomplish being able to meditate. We all want to do that. We want to learn how to meditate, and we want to do it, and we want to succeed in it, just like everything else that we do. And that's the whole point, is that meditation is totally not like everything else we do. It's not something to accomplish or achieve or obtain. Meditation practice is a way of undoing that very propensity that we all have of wanting to do something, to accomplish something, to achieve something with our, in this case, with our mind. So with the in-breath and with letting go of any technique, we're gradually learning, ideally, how to let go of doing. And doing is extremely deeply ingrained in all of us. Basically, from the moment we're born, we're trying to do things. So it doesn't undo very quickly. And that gap ends up provoking, or not ends up, or is intentionally geared to provoke psychological material that's normally held in the subconscious to come to the surface. And to release the pent-up energy that's unconsciously involved in keeping that material at bay, and bring that material up within the context of meditation so that we see it in a different way, we experience it in a different way, and we learn how to release it in a very different way. And this then becomes the bridge for how we bring meditation practice into our everyday life, in terms of how do we deal with difficult emotions and people and situations in our world, is that we've trained on the cushion in working with difficult emotions and experiences within ourselves that come up on the cushion. And in case you haven't experienced it yet, you're in for a treat, because this will happen. If you follow this practice, you will have a lot of stuff will come up. Rinpoche called this psychological baggage that we have in our system, in our psyche, in our unconscious or subconscious, and we're processing it over time through meditation practice. So we're going through different states of mind as we go through the meditation practice, all because we don't have this continuous object of meditation to keep our attention steady, so that what normal meditation practices do that have a continuous object is you're focusing on that object and suppressing everything else, putting everything else away as if you can bypass it. And so that's the essence of, people talk about bypassing these days, is okay, I can bypass that stuff and I'm just going to go right for, some sort of enlightenment. And it just doesn't work that way. You have to work with your inheritance, your wonderful karmic inheritance that you've cultivated and watered and developed and nurtured throughout this lifetime, if not many lifetimes. That gap is the birth of intelligence. What happens in the gap is the birth of intelligence, is basically emphasizing the other of the two main qualities of shamatha, which Rinpoche talks about in these talks. He gives the Tibetan Sheshan. He translates it as, he describes it initially as knowing, and then translates it as awareness. And there's an interesting affiliation of that with Vipassana, because it is the bridge to Vipassana practice, is developing that critical intelligence of knowing what's going on, knowing initially whether we're meditating or that we are meditating, like remembering that we're meditating, and then beyond that, understanding how our mind works, understanding what neurosis is, how we create neurosis for ourselves, and how we have habitual patterns, and how we live in different realms created by these habitual patterns. And he spoke on many occasions, one of his most common teachings was on those patterns, which he used the framework of the 6 realms of existence. Together, pairing them together, we're starting from the very start, we're practicing shamatha and vipassana. Traditionally, one would start with shamatha, and then there would be a deliberate introduction of vipassana using deliberate practices, deliberate analytical, discursive practices. But Rinpoche teaches the more Dzogchen or Maha'ati or Vajrayana version of vipassana, which is not an analytical practice, but is based on the direct seeing of the nature of our mind through the cultivation of the mindfulness, the focused attention to the breath, the out-breath, the precision that comes from that, and the realization of our mind that comes from that, and then the understanding of the overall process that comes from the gap, where we have this wonderful opportunity to experience what does our mind do when it has nothing to alight upon. It's like a fish out of water. A fish out of water will flop around endlessly trying to find its home, its water. And our mind is like that. When you ask the mind to not do something, it flounders and flips around every which way. And instead of presenting just that technique, which would be too advanced for people, and I think from what I hear, Rinpoche did that initially, and gave people a completely formless meditation instruction. And I think he decided that was not helpful working for Westerners. And so by the time of this teaching in 1974, he had already started to begin a process that he went on for a number of years of adding more and more structure and formal traditional aspects to his presentation of the practice of shamatha and vipassana meditation, later going through all the traditional depths involved in the various aspects of the technique. Let's see, the way that he presented the practice, the logic of the practice, or the progression of the practice, was unique in that at the same time he presents the overall progression. He tells you what the more advanced stages of the practice are, but then he emphasizes that you need to experience shamatha before you can experience vipassana. That vipassana will happen, naturally. And so you can't provoke it, you can't do some special technique, some magical formula, or some specific exercise to provoke vipassana. So it has that sort of natural stopgap for our usual ego methodology of just wanting to skip ahead all the time. However, it's very important to pay really close attention to that when he says you need to actually experience shamatha for genuine vipassana to naturally emerge. And I think many of us have learned over many, many years of trying to experience genuine meditation practice that the importance of actually being able to experience a genuine, stable sense of shamatha practice, or a stable experience of shamatha practice, and that only then will vipassana emerge. So the progression as he presents it, but he makes an emphasis upon not deceiving ourselves, thinking that we're able to do something we're not able to do, and in thereby sort of further encouraging and sharpening the discriminating knowledge within students, which is the incipient form of what he calls prajna, or transcendent wisdom, which is what experiences or sees directly the nature of reality, which ideally leads, or is said to lead to, the enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition. He presents, early on in his time in America, he presented meditation instruction on a one-to-one basis, working very closely, physically and psychologically with his students individually. And because that is so important. So when we see then this presentation to a large group of people that he did in this course and in many other times, he therefore created a system where those early students, his earliest students that he's been training for a number of years in the practice, in the understanding, he then has them act as meditation instructors for other students. And he created this whole system of meditation instructors where people would meet one-on-one with beginners and intermediate students, would meet one-on-one with more advanced students, advanced meaning primarily just you've been doing it longer. So you've sort of been down the road, you've experienced more of what one experiences in this practice. And he placed an enormous emphasis on this, and like being very precise about his presentation of the technique, and our being very literal about following that technique. It's important to do this with the meditation instruction system as well, and really make utilize that opportunity that the system he created, which exists today, of meditation instruction and instructor and student, continues, because that is the direct link with him. There's a transmission that occurs in that situation that's hard to describe and quantify. In addition, in terms of the presentation, you'll see in this series of talks, there's a talk called Understanding the Nature of Mind, or something to that effect. That may not be the exact title, but he gives this whole talk on different aspects of mind, which in many other traditions of Buddhism would be very unusual to give that much of a sort of technical, detailed talk about the structure of mind in the context of a teaching on meditation practice. But that was a mark of the uniqueness of his presentation, and he did this many, many times when he taught meditation, is that he would begin by explaining the structure of mind, because the practice in this tradition is all about understanding the mind. The mind is the source of everything, as the Buddha says in the opening verse of his Dhammapada. Everything begins with the mind. And so the Vajrayana tradition in particular focuses on the mind and understanding the different aspects of mind, because that's what the Vipassana experience is in essence. It's understanding the nature of mind, and understanding the nature of mind is understanding the nature of the entirety of reality. So he gives this very complicated talk where he goes through 3 different aspects of mind, or at least he does 2 of them. In other places he goes through the 3rd, called Sem, but here he goes through Lodro and Rigpa, and then he goes through the 5 skandhas in the midst of a talk on meditation. Again, the structure of our experience of ourselves and our world, of how we experience, because the meditation practice is an immersion in understanding who we are and how we experience our world. So a very unusual way of presenting the practice, by giving that level of sophistication to students in the course of a presentation on meditation practice. Lastly, I think, is that it's not evident, because Rinpoche doesn't say, okay, now I'm going to give you a guided meditation. And today, these days, people do guided meditations, and everyone will get in the posture and the teacher will go through a guided meditation. But a lot of what Rinpoche is saying is an actual guided meditation, where he's describing what the way you can work with your mind, what you experience on a cushion. And he had a rather amazing, if not like magical, ability to understand what his students were experiencing. I think he had the intimacy of his relationship with his students, where he would talk to them about everything, and ask them what their experience is, and really understand what we were experiencing. And so he's describing that in many of these talks. He'll shift from the very technical description of qualities and terms and their how you spell them and so forth, and then he'll shift into where he's actually describing how to practice, how to meditate. And I think it's helpful to understand when he's doing that, and actually sit with that and let yourself experience what he's trying to present, and relax a little bit the usual propensity to try to understand and categorize and associate what's being transmitted, and let him lead you in that experience of meditation practice, where he's also using his maybe I should say incomplete grammar, usage of English grammar, which is not perfect or normal for most of us. And I think that's part of the way that he's creating an experience for us. And so I think it's helpful to know that, so that when he does that, you can experience it in that way. And I think that's all I have to say today. I forgot one very important thing. There we go. Good. Is that the alternation of the breath, the in-breath and the out-breath, the focus on the out-breath and then letting go of the in-breath. He describes the in-breath as being the essence of the survival instinct, the essence of the instinct to establish and affirm and build up our sense of who we are, or that we are, our sense of that we exist. And the out-breath is an emphasis upon opening and expanding and letting go of our clinging to who we are, and clinging to the sense of I exist. So that's really important, and also radical and unique, in that most meditation teachers and practices are really meant to calm the practitioner and help the practitioner stabilize themselves. There's a lot of emphasis on loving kindness in a certain way, particularly these days, towards ourselves. And when you look at it in the lens or the framework of what he's presenting here, we can begin to see that some of that ends up reinforcing the sense of self. And Rinpoche, in his characteristic style of cutting through spiritual materialism, is from the beginning deconstructing our sense of self and our sense of security in that self, and in that sense of self, and the way of using meditation practice as a further means of establishing and securing and feeling our sense of self and feeling safe in who we are. Which is not to say that meditation was presented as a devastating life, existential devastation sort of practice. In fact, to the opposite, where later he begins to explain that shamatha practice is the ultimate loving kindness or metta or maitri practice. And that actually that way of relating to ourselves, of not clinging to the sense of self, is a way of reducing suffering. And that way of learning how to work with thoughts by releasing them and not investing them with importance is the essence of maitri, or loving kindness to oneself. So I think I've said a lot of different things, and maybe, hopefully, some of it makes sense. Let me see. Oh, there's one other thing. Okay, this will be the last thing, since I'm almost over time, is that in line with the whole experience of cutting through spiritual materialism, and meditation is not something that we accomplish and build ourselves up with. One of the key aspects of this technique and the way that Rinpoche presented it is the experience of boredom. And the last thing that we want out of life, out of any experience, or out of any endeavor, is boredom. And he made that into something to feel good about, or something. He encouraged the experience of boredom in this interesting way, that boredom was the experience of the opportunity to experience our preoccupation with content and entertainment, our incessant, constant fixation on there having to be something going on. And first we experience that as frustration, or he called hot boredom, and then gradually over time, we begin to see the incessant, repetitive, and not helpful quality of that habitual fixation. And we experience what he called cool boredom. And through that process, we're learning how to implement another very important aspect of the technique that he called touch and go, where we touch upon thoughts and then we let go, which I described earlier as not dismissing them and not fixating on them. And he was unique in his ability to come up with very nice phrases that really captured the essence of the technique in a way that we could relate to and experience individually and personally. And I think that's it for today. So I think we'll end there, and I hope you enjoy this series, and I hope you watch it a few times, because it takes a few times to really connect with it. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to try to contribute something useful to this series. And fortunately, there's really wonderful teachers who will explain this material to you. Thank you.